So let's do a little talking about solution-focused or solution-oriented therapies and social justice. Um, the worksheet that I sent to you all shows 4 distinct categories of ways in which a lot of people, including myself, might conceptualize solution-oriented therapies as being in alignment with social justice framework. Now you'll notice that on the left-hand side there's the word postmodernism, and the reason I put that there is for all of us to sort of keep in mind this conceptual picture that generally, more often than not, any therapeutic approach that comes out of the postmodern framework is considered to be a socially oriented, social justice oriented approach. And the reason for that being that the postmodern framework really lends these specific approaches to challenging the status quo or challenging some of the dominant discourses that we see in some of the modern framework approaches to therapy. So let me just talk a little bit about these 4 distinct categories here and how we might conceptualize these to support a social justice framework in terms of therapy. The first one you'll see is that it's client-informed. And again, this is challenging that discourse about therapist expertise and knowing what problem clients have and then knowing how to fix that problem. And this really places, it really empowers the client to now be the one that gets to define solutions or goals that they would like to achieve. So it's acknowledging that while therapists might be experts in facilitating a particular process, they aren't necessarily experts on the content of clients' lives, which also means we might not be the experts on determining what kinds of solutions or goals clients should be working towards. In fact, it should be the clients who are deciding those things for themselves. So that's one way where it's really, from a social justice framework perspective, there's an emphasis placed on empowering people in dominated or marginalized positions. And this is one way that solution-focused therapy comes in line with that, because it now is doing that for the client. It's empowering the client, and it's transforming some of those top-down power processes that oftentimes are replicated within a modern approach. The second point is that solution-oriented therapies are brief. Now you might be wondering, how is being brief in line with the social justice framework? Now if we look back at some of the modern approaches and even psychoanalysis or psychodynamic approaches in an individual therapeutic capacity, if we think about the time that some of those approaches might require individuals and families to be engaged, that could take years, it could take months, and that for a lot of families and individuals is financially not possible, which oftentimes means that getting access to services, there's a different socioeconomic level that sometimes people are at. So the solution-oriented approach really developed out of a lot of work with lower socioeconomic clients, oftentimes those who are from marginalized or oppressed communities, and realizing that these clients and families are probably not going to have the same access capability to longer-term therapeutic approaches for financial reasons. So this really inspired them to look at each session as though it was their one shot. What change could they make? And again, these families and clients were experiencing multiple stressors, so clients needed help or change immediately. It wasn't a long process that they had the privilege or liberty to take. So the idea of having a therapy that's brief was really in line with a social justice framework perspective, in that it made access much more readily available to a broader base of clients, specifically clients who might occupy lower socioeconomic spaces. And it really then connects to the last category of solution-focused, that by focusing on solutions, we're not only allowing clients to step out of a problem or pathology definition or understanding of their circumstances, but we're empowering them to believe that change can happen and that they are critical players in the change process. And in fact, that they themselves drive the change process and have the capabilities and resources to direct how to get there. So again, a social justice framework is really about changing up the power hierarchy and dynamics and empowering the client, highlighting the client's strengths and resources, highlighting their expertise and their know-how in terms of what they think that they need and the change that they desire. So there's just some of those ways that a solution-oriented therapeutic approach really aligns with a social justice framework. Now the last one, which I skipped, is this idea of cooperation that we've talked about together as a class. And we've mostly also mentioned it in terms of the hesitancy that a lot of solution-oriented therapists express when thinking about the idea of client resistance. A lot of solution-oriented therapists think that if we embrace this idea of resistance, it sort of puts us into an oppositional relationship with the client from the get-go, and that sometimes can act counter to what the goal of therapy is, which is to pursue change. So sometimes that can cause us as therapists to see the client through maybe a more pathological lens. For instance, if clients aren't receptive to maybe some of the strategies that we're suggesting to them for how they can change and achieve the goals that we think that they should be working towards, there might be times when we're tempted to sort of see the incongruence that they experience as resistance to our help or as resistance to the therapeutic process. Whereas when we look at the idea of cooperation and assuming that clients are there because they want to be cooperative, we're already coming alongside them in a collaborative way that sees them as almost like a co-traveler, that they ultimately are bringing themselves to this space because they are wanting to participate in a journey of change. Which is a really different way for a lot of us to think about approaching clients. And it can potentially change the lens through which we see some of their engagement in the clinical space. For instance, if we take on this idea of client resistance and we have a client that maybe hasn't come to session for 3 weeks, one way we could understand that is that they are resistant to treatment. But if we take on this idea of cooperation and we really embrace that, we're probably going to be very curious about potential barriers that might exist in their context or environment that are inhibiting them from being able to be present, because our assumption is that they want to be. Our assumption is that not that they don't want to be. So we might be able to continue to build a collaborative relationship with them in ways that sort of acknowledge their circumstance and that still maintains the idea of them wanting to be cooperative with the therapeutic process. So maybe someone has transportation difficulties. If we think that clients want to be cooperative, we might be more curious about looking into that, making accommodations for that. Whereas if we're not really thinking of clients as already innately being cooperative to the therapeutic process, we might do less checking. And this isn't true across the board, but it's possible that we could do less checking in on maybe what are some of the extraneous things going on that might be preventing them from being able to make it to therapy for their sessions. So these are all just a few ways of how we can understand the social justice framework really being supported by a solution-oriented approach. And I know that having you guys fill this out, this wasn't in the reading, so this is requiring you to kind of think critically and make some inferences about how each of these categories could potentially be in line with some social justice ideas or social justice frameworks. So it is just interesting for me to see how you understood these, and after listening to this, maybe what some of the points of connection were between what I'm offering and sort of what you were thinking, and then maybe some different perspectives that you brought about these things. Now, there is also a few things that we could say potentially about the solution-oriented therapies and the potential lack of awareness to certain contextual issues or to certain power dynamics. And I'm curious to see what all of you think about this in light of some of our readings about postmodern feminism and about the idea of patriarchy, for instance. Because it has been critiqued, and I myself have some thoughts and wonderings about how the solution-oriented approach supports gender equity or potentially reifies gender inequity. So that's, while I do see a lot of components from the solution-oriented approaches to be in line with a social justice-oriented framework, there are also pieces that leave me wondering as well. For instance, I wonder about some gendered power patterns that might be replicated or reified within the solution-oriented approach, mostly because I've not necessarily seen where there's an articulated attention to those power dynamics. And so that's a particular area of curiosity and wonderment for myself, and I'm curious about what you guys think about that, which you'll get to talk about in your critique or analysis of this specific approach in your case analysis papers. The other piece that we didn't get a chance to talk about because we didn't have class was the article about emotion. Oftentimes, as you notice from the article, solution-oriented therapies can be critiqued for what is perceived to be their lack of attention to emotion. And just in case you didn't pick up on this, just to reiterate kind of the perspective of the article, is that it's an ongoing conversation, obviously, in the field, but there are proponents of a solution-oriented approach that argue for the fact that emotion is not a standalone experience that necessarily needs to be addressed outside of everything else. So a lot of solution-oriented therapists see that the approach does attend to emotion because emotion isn't separate from all the other aspects of who we are. It's not separate from our thoughts. It's not separate from our action. So, and it's also not separate from our imagining the future, imagining solutions, constructing solutions. As the article suggested, emotion is integrated and is a part of all of that process. It's interweaved. So just so there's some clarification about that others would feel like maybe emotion needs its own space and to be specifically addressed, whereas not all solution-oriented therapists take that approach. So that's kind of the rebuttal that they offer to that critique, but it still is very much an ongoing conversation about this specific approach.